We are living in a time, we have come of age and started our families in a time of enormous social upheaval. Not only does our life not at all reflect the adolescence, young adulthood, and beginning of family life that our parents' generation experienced, it doesn't even reflect remotely our own memories of our own childhoods. The social changes have happened so rapidly that the playbooks that we grew up with, both by word of mouth and by our own observation and experience, are no longer relevant or useful. However, not all change is bad, just as not all change is good. And it is not random. It is with a little bit of effort, we can understand it, its causes, its trajectory, and we can foresee how, in our time, many of the forces that have seemingly been flying in one direction are slowing and beginning to reverse course. That the conditions are ripe if we are prepared to take advantage of the opportunity. The conditions are ripe for us to rebuild what has been deconstructed over the past 75 or 100 years. So in this video, I want to cover three key topics that I have identified and analyzed to better understand how my own family has been set up in the conditions that we are, and how to chart a strategy, a path out of this situation. So my name is Marcus, and after nearly 20 years in military intelligence and the national security sector, when I felt that my domestic life was at a tipping point, when I could foresee that it was going down a path that would not take me where I wanted to go, I took the unexpected step back from my career to focus on my family. And over the past 4 years, I have been applying those same military intelligence and national security analytical, strategic, and risk management paradigms to better understand how families today, what forces are acting against them, and how to anticipate how those forces will change in coming decades. So here's a brief overview of what I want to cover in this video. First of all, is I want to introduce to you something that you likely have not given a lot of time and attention to, which is the pendulum swing that began in the Industrial Revolution and set up a recognition of why that pendulum is going to swing back. Then I want to I want to explore how we can be ready for that pendulum to swing. When it starts moving back in the other direction, as I would suggest it already has begun to do, what will it take for you and I, as husbands and fathers, to be well positioned to direct that movement, to be prepared to seize that opportunity, so that our children will grow up while they're still in our homes and then go on in their own adult lives on a better course than the one that we inherited and were set up for. And to that effect, we're going to end this video on a specific first step. Once we recognize the changes that are coming, we recognize how we can position ourselves to be ready for them. We can also identify what's the first step that we'll need to take to move, to shift the direction of that pendulum swing, to seize that opportunity as it presents itself. What is our first priority? All right, so let's get into it. So in order to contextualize this pendulum swing, in order to understand what we're looking at, how we got where we are, it's very important, and this is a key concept in intelligence analysis, in strategic planning and risk management, is that you need to find a way to break free of your own preconceived notions and assumptions. Part of the challenge is that you and I, the conditions around us, as turbulent and fast as they seem to have changed in our own lifetimes, that is just a very zoomed in micro picture of the arc of history, right? And so we need to, step one, break ourselves out of this false perception that either our childhood or our young adulthood or today how things are is sort of like the norm, right? Like that assumption, that perception needs to be surfaced and validated or revised. So let's take a big step back. There's a couple different ways to do this. Today in this video, we're going to take the big step back and we're going to say, well, what is the human condition and what has the arc of human history and experience been like, so that we have a context for analyzing this particular pendulum swing that we're currently experiencing, because it is a micro situation on a macro scale. So that macro scale is, and I'm not going to go through each of these lines, but it's worth noting that human beings have been around for 200,000 years. That's 200 thousands. So think of something that's 200 years old, like the United States of America is 250 years old. Okay, now do that 999 more times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 whole histories of the entire United States would be 2,500 years. I would need to do that 10 count 100 more times. I need 1,000 times the entire history of the United States of America to have a complete picture of human experience. Now, some will say that's sort of a false straw man. That's a false framing, because those are just biological humans. And that's a fair critique. So let's narrow it down. For 50,000 years, not 200, now we're down to 50. 50,000 years we've had neurological humans. So 50,000 years ago, a human being then had the same wiring in inside their skull that you and I have right now. We can narrow that down even further. We can be even more modest and say, well, 15,000 years ago. So we're still saying go all the way back to the Roman Empire, 2,000 years. Okay, that's one. Now count that out 8 times, and you'd get, that's how many times it would take for you to get to the first human who had the same cognitive ability as you and I. So not only are they same biologically and neurologically, they have the same hardware and same firmware, but now they're running the same operating system. Okay, so they have the same abstract thinking and ability to reason and strategize. Their capability was the same then as it is now. Narrow it down even further, and the probably the fairest point to start measuring, because the point at which we're not all of our conditions, all of our criteria of being human are all lined up as of 10,000 years ago. 10,000 years ago, we were fully indistinguishable human beings from you and I today. So it's go back 2,000 years to the Roman Empire. That is 1/5 of the span that you have to keep going back 4 more times to get to human beings that are indistinguishable from you and I in every way. So it's 10,000 years of human history, and only 175 years, okay, 1.75%, less than 2% of that 10,000 year history have we been in the current pendulum swing we're experiencing today. Okay, what do I mean by this pendulum swing? Let's pull out some examples. For all but the last 175 years, on the screen here I have 2 columns. On the left is a depiction of what life was like for 10,000 years until the last 175, which predominantly involved small communities of people living an agrarian lifestyle, did not move around geographically much anymore. There was a lot of migration and hunter-gatherer times, but once people had, 10,000 years ago, established an agricultural way of life, they could establish permanent settlements. They could begin to build a sustaining and enduring community that knew how to exist in harmony with the ebbs and flows, the rhythms of the natural world. And so people were born into, grew up in, lived out their lives in these small agrarian communities. Then, so 10,000 years, until 175 years ago, when we made some drastic changes all at once. In the course of a few generations, Instead of life predominantly taking place in small agrarian communities, we began urbanization. All right. And so instead of living your whole life out in togetherness with your not only your nuclear but extended family and lifelong community members, lifelong friends and extended networks, um, we were instead plucked out as individuals, but especially as nuclear families, plucked out of those communities and migrating to urban settings with other nuclear families coming from all different points of origin to be consolidated into a tight, congested space. So no longer do we have lifelong extended family and community networks. Instead, we have strangers. And instead of having wide open space, low population density, we are crammed into little tight spaces on top of each other. And the other thing that went along with that is instead of children being around their mother and father all day, every day, as well as their aunts and uncles and cousins, all day, every day, performing agricultural work alongside their family members and community members, now men, as the industrial workers, were pulled out of the home. And so, beginning 175 years ago, we started a lifestyle where instead of mother, father, children, and extended family all spending all day together every day, we had men being segregated into an industrial work environment for the majority of waking hours and the majority of the days of the week, while children and women who were separated from their extended family and community networks were left in isolation away from their husbands and fathers. Now, the third thing that goes along with it, sort of unintended consequence of this, is that, or sort of the hidden effect of this, is that instead of having a community that had a shared culture, a set of common beliefs and values in those small and enduring agrarian communities, when we shuffled people together, have a mashup of people in these urban and industrialized settings, it means that either there's going to be continuous conflict between people who have differing beliefs and values, or in order to get along, we're going to drop away our beliefs and values. And so with the uprooting of people, the disconnection from their enduring communities, the mashing up of them into urban settings, there is a sort of hidden effect that we begin to erode or incentivize people to let go of their beliefs and values that for 10,000 years were consistent, right, or enduring. So there's a togetherness effect. There's a, we go from all being together to having no father. We go from extended family and community interdependence to nuclear family islands. And we go from common beliefs and values to either secretly holding beliefs and values or abandoning beliefs and values. So all of those are the consequence of economic and industrial consolidation, right? Now, then there was another change, even less than, so 175 years ago, as what I'm using as the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the Industrial Age. 75 years ago, back in 1950, we had the Information Age. And so the next set of changes were not only were fathers separated from their wives and children in order to work, but so too were women separated from their husbands and now their children as well, so they could both go to work, right? So when the Information Age came into being is when we began normalizing both men and women leaving their homes and communities and going off to be in some industrialized or standardized corporate work environment. Again, that idea that we were born into was invented 75 years ago, even less than the Industrial Revolution, after 10,000 years of marital and family and community cohesion, right? So we're 75 years into this experiment of men and women leaving their children every day to go to a workplace. Now, what that also meant was, instead of migration primarily happening by nuclear family, particularly in the information age where higher education and credentialing were key factors in securing a livelihood, either as an individual or for a family, it meant not only did you grow up, get married, and then take your family somewhere where there's an industrial center that you could earn a livelihood. Now you grow up, and before you even get married, you separate from your family and community to go to some institution of learning and credentialing. So even earlier on, there is separation from community, from shared values and beliefs and interdependence, and there is isolation as the norm at the individual level. And then that individual who is now isolated has to find their own way independently and perhaps marry some stranger from a different community with different beliefs and values, who is also separated from their family and community of origin. And then, so they get married and have children. But then they both leave those children to go to work every day, so that the children never grow up with any community, right? So in the course of 2 shifts, we went from children growing up and spending their entire childhood and adolescence in the shadow of their mother and father, to then children growing up in the shadow of their mother, to now children growing up with absent mothers and fathers as the norm, which is a 75-year experiment that we were born into. And the next layer of that is, not only are children in our generation away from their mother and father for more of the time than any human has been in the entirety of human history, but let's just be humble and use the 10,000 year marker. So for 75 out of 10,000 years, we've been experimenting with this. Maybe children don't need to be around their mom and dad, hypothesis. Well, they also aren't around aunts, uncles, cousins, grandparents, or even brothers and sisters. Because what we do is, for the entire time that the parents are in their segregated work environments, children are in age-segregated environments. So they spend their entire life, rather than continuously being around people of different ages doing different things that make the community function, they're just on the assembly line of education and extracurriculars that is increasingly compulsory, or at least seems compulsory, because of the rat race to get the education and the credential so that you can be rewarded with showing up to some corporate environment away from your spouse and children for the rest of your life. Okay, so let's think through all of what would we expect when we make these changes? What have the consequences of these changes been? What is the state of marriage and family life and childhood today? What is the state of our communities? And how have those things been shaped by these changes that began 175 years ago and then were then doubled down upon 75 years ago? Well, essentially, instead of children constantly being surrounded by people who are invested in their long-term well-being, who love and care about them, children are now predominantly brought up by institutions, right? Strangers in buildings run by the government, whether it's a school or an extracurricular, from an increasingly young age, an increasing amount of the day. Children are being raised by strangers instead of by people who are invested in them as human beings. On the family level, on the marriage and family level, what we see is increasing dysfunction and hopelessness, right? And so it's pretty easy to see the charts, and at some point I will make a slide that demonstrates this, but I think we all just know as a fact, you can't help but know that for the same time that we've gone through this experiment of separating men and women all day, every day from each other and their children, that has coincided with a decreased number of people getting married and of the people who get married, an increasing number of them getting divorced. So there's fewer people getting married, and of the people who get married, even fewer who stay married. And that, I mean, is naturally, obviously, a causal relationship with the way we've changed our lifestyles based on the industrial and then information age. First of all, because of the way that we match people up instead of people who are from the same community with the same beliefs and values, running a similar playbook as that which they observed and were tutored or apprenticed in. No, instead we rip them out of any community with any common beliefs and values, match them up in a place where beliefs and values are downplayed or rejected, and then ask them to raise a family and maintain a relationship while they have the least time together and the least support of any set of human beings who have ever existed. Okay, so unsurprisingly, that's going poorly. And across the board in every age group, the consequence has been less happiness, right? Less fulfillment, less meaning, more psychological and emotional distress, more mental conditions, more attempts to sedate and distract one's self in a combination of technology and medication, because there's something deeply wrong with the way that we are living in a totally understandable way. Now, admittedly, we have the advantage of hindsight, right? It's too easy to say, given what we know now, given all the demographic and polling data that shows how terribly this state of affairs is, being a disservice to people of every demographic and age group. Now it's so obvious how these things were going to play out. But we have to be generous to our, predecessors on two fronts. One, some of the changes I just described were not particularly sold. It was more, in many cases, a total necessity, right? An economic or social compulsion to relocate, to seek a job of this type, because those are the kinds of jobs available. And so there's been a lot of undesired, compelled transition for many people over the past 175 years. Now, on the other hand, there are some cases where these factors or things that swim with them, right, accompany them, are a matter of bad ideas, right? People getting it in their head that, if we make certain changes to the way we live our lives, that'll be better. There'll be good things that will come from that. And it's not necessarily that there are zero good things or that they were entirely 100% incorrect, but it is a matter of, you may have failed to account for the downsides or the risks, right? And so if you offer me medication to treat an ailment I have a runny nose, you give me a pill and you say, this pill will make sure your runny nose goes away. You may also lose your sight. You may become blind if you use this medication. I think I would just live with the runny nose, right? But if we get fixated on no, I need to fix this symptom, this condition at any cost, or we say, I need to fix this condition, and this person has promised that if we do XYZ, make XYZ changes to the way we live our lives, it will fix that condition. And I just don't care about any consequences. I'm not willing to consider that there might be downsides. Well, then that gets you where we are today with all of these downsides, because we have either through a combination of being compelled and being naive or short-sighted, we've rushed our way through a series of social changes that have deconstructed marriages, families, childhood, community, society at every level, right? Now, one of the most insidious aspects of this is because we say, we've centralized production, we've centralized industry, we've centralized commerce, and we're going to raise the bar on criteria to be eligible to work in industry and commerce. So you have to get these degrees, you have to get these certifications. In order to get these certifications, there's more and more that you must do as a child and adolescent or young adult, which means there's less and less time, at least in theory. So the sales pitch seems to go. There's less and less time available for you to do enriching things that don't go on your college application or go on your job resume. And so, like, being a human, doing activities that don't result in a certificate, that are just enriching, are not incentivized, are not prioritized in our society today, which means that you're less and less capable, you're less and less responsible, you have less and less self-confidence and initiative because you're on a narrow track, right? You are a mouse in a maze, and there's only one kind of cheese that you're allowed to pursue. And so you're a caged animal. As a Gen X, maybe a little bit, definitely millennials, you know, we're raising caged animals who have never touched grass, never had to hunt for food, literally or figuratively, and who can hardly operate on their own, much less establish and maintain a household. And so we've been told collectively, well, that's okay because you'll get the credential, you'll get the job, and then all that stuff that, like makes life happen, you don't have to do that stuff anymore. You'll just work and you'll earn the money to turn around and pay other people to make life work. And so now you've ratcheted yourself into it's a one-way, paint yourself in a corner, self-fulfilling prophecy of we're putting all our chips on institutional reciprocity. We follow the rules, you give us the cheese, we get the credential, we get the money, we'll do the work for the corporation, everything will be taken care of, except for human relationships, right? So our marriages and our relationships with our children, our relationships among our children, our extended families and communities, none of that will be taken care of because you can't buy that. You have to spend the time and energy. And the creativity and critical thinking and open-mindedness and self-initiated endeavors, we're not going to worry about that either. That's not a thing that the education to corporation pipeline cares about. So there is, interestingly, one institution that has preserved people from many of these perils. Not all of them, but there's one institution in society today where people have not been raised as caged animals on a single track with no broader understanding of themselves as humans or ability to operate. The one place in our society today where people are preserved from this total dependence upon and sort of like narrowness to like living life following one way to get cheese, if you will, is, of course, the United States military, right? So in the military, unlike your civilian counterpart when you're 18 or 22, somewhere in that range, you will, sorry, wrong slide. Nope. Okay. When you enter the military, what will happen is, although you, like your civilian counterpart who is isolated from their family, you will not just be an individual, right? Just like all on your own. You'll be assigned to a unit where you will be quickly forced into forming, storming, and norming and creating a cohesive interpersonal relationship with the people around you. Now, there is a false narrative that being in a college dorm and being in an army barracks is like equivalent coming of age activities, and I assure you that it is not. Because in a college setting, you have nothing forcing you into a common bond other than looking for ways to waste time and money, right? You're at a low point of independence and responsibility. And you're at a low point of real consequences for your decision making, either as an individual or a group. And so, whereas the military brings adulthood forward and immediately holds people accountable for their actions, uh, it compels them to be considerate of their duties to those around them, their responsibilities to perform their own roles and responsibilities in support of the group. College has none of those things, despite some weak attempt to compare student government or some fraternity or sorority to military life. That kind of play acting of responsibility, that extension of adolescence into early or mid 20s, is exactly the opposite of what the military provides in terms of meaningful purpose, shared beliefs and values, and responsibility for one's self and other people. So it's for these reasons that veterans of the military have an advantage over their peers that enables them in this coming age, as the pendulum is about to swing, which we'll cover next, the swing of the pendulum. Veterans are best poised to guide and seize that opportunity for themselves, their own families, and for their children. Obviously, people who did not serve in the military, there will be some people out there who, for their situation was such that they did have, a more fruitful and beneficial adolescence and young adulthood than the cliche that I am painting. I don't deny that that exists. What I am saying is that in the case of military veterans, that experience is more consistent. It's more repeatable. It's more by design. And so there's a higher level of confidence that men today who at one time served in the military did experience that kind of formation that is distinct from the broader cultural context. And it's for that reason that at F4F, Fit for Fatherhood, membership is prioritized for military veterans, because a lot of what we're going to help men go through, build up, is dependent upon that kind of ownership, that kind of self-discipline, self-awareness, and a healthy relationship to their duty to their wife, their children, their community, as necessary elements to fostering the mindset that will help them lead their family into the next social wave, the next transition that we're going to go through as the pendulum swings back from this extreme of dysfunction that we are now living. Okay, so now let's talk about why is this pendulum going to swing? How is it going to swing? What does that look like? The reason that we, I'm not going to repeat myself, I promise. I'm not going to repeat all the elements. But how we got to a place where mothers and fathers and children are all separate for their entire lives, for the vast majority of every day and every day of the week, is because they are all living in a maze where their optionality is very limited, and they're just being obligated to follow the path to the cheese that is being offered to them by the centralized hubs or, the centers of commerce and the centers of information and education. If you want to get a job, if you want to make money, you need to get a job at some major corporation. That major corporation is probably in some major city, and they're going to require you to have some kind of degree or credential. That model is going away. Right? We have already come out of the high water mark of that model being necessary and maybe even viable. There will always be corporations, there will always be some industrial centers, but what there will never be again, as there was in the 19th and 20th century, when the playbook that we grew up being taught as that playbook was being written, right, was when we were at a high point of centralized industry and commerce and centralized information and education. When our parents and grandparents were adolescents and young adults, the only way to learn was to go to school, to go to a university. That's the only way to obtain information, at least the information that you needed in order to be capable of performing a job that would earn you money. Today, all the information that had only existed inside the brick and mortar universities is all available online. Much of it put there by those universities. But in addition to all the information that you can ever learn at a university being available to you online, you don't have to, like, again, it's like cable, right? You used to have to get all the channels. That was the only option. Similarly with universities, you had to take all these courses. They needed a way to extract from you a certain amount of time and dollars. But now you can do an a la carte thing. You say, no, I only want the channels I want. I only want the courses I want that are actually going to serve me in my life and in my career. Because, oh, by the way, the consolidation, the monopoly on corporate and commercial activity is also going away. Because we're no longer as dependent as we once were, by orders of magnitude, as dependent on gatekeepers with regard to marketing, information exchange, and logistics. So it is now possible in any part of the world, and especially, in the United States or in the West, any person is connected to the internet where they can obtain the information that they need. They can connect with people who want to do business with them. They can market their skills and offer their time, none of which was available 75 years ago when we went all in on saying both men and women are going to go to school, get degrees, and get full-time jobs, and all of their children are going to be wards of the state raised by institutions. None of that has to be that way anymore. So we can swing the pendulum right back and say, I don't have to, as a young adolescent or young adult, leave my hometown to go get an education. I don't have to leave ever. Or if I do, I can come back because I don't have to let where some corporate headquarters is dictate where I go to live. I can work for any corporation from anywhere, or I can work for not any corporation. I can work for anyone or for myself from anywhere. And so again, now I say, well, wait, why would I go to some big city where I'm on top of a bunch of strangers and where I have to pay other people to do things that used to be done by extended family and community members? Like, hey, can you watch my kid while I go to the grocery store? No, that's not an option when you don't know anybody. But if you were in your hometown and your sister lived down the street, you could. And so if you can work for the same corporation from Iowa as you used to have to be in New York City, why would I not be in Iowa where your friends and family are, where there's wide open space and clean air and and activities that don't involve syringes and broken needles in alleyways for kids to do? And so all of the forces that began 175 years ago and we doubled down on 75 years ago are dissipating. None of those compulsory forces exist anymore. And so the optionality that we have today and that our children will have as they grow up is even greater than, it's even better than it was more than 175 years ago. They could go anywhere. They can communicate with anyone. They can do anything that they want from anywhere, and they can optimize their life choices to overcome, to reverse what we have seen, what we now have the lived experience and the data to support, that this entire experiment over the past 75 years has only led to dysfunction and despair and misery for everyone. I'm not saying there's nothing good about it. I'm just saying it obviously isn't good for our psychological, emotional, or social health. Okay. Now, one thing that is missing, there are still two major gaps, is that although there's this opportunity, there's this option that will be available to us now and for our children that was not available to our parents and grandparents, there's still something missing that makes it difficult for us to walk it back, is because there isn't, in all likelihood for most of us, some agrarian or otherwise enduring community of family and friends to which we can go back, right? So the communities have been disintegrated and dissolved, and so there's nowhere to go back to. Now, building that network and having a renaissance, a rediscovery of the kinds of dynamics and implicit knowledge transfer that occurred within those and during extended families, there is not any way to just turn that back on again, but there is a way to rebuild it. And that is where a father today who is ready, who can see this coming, and who can put a strategy into place for himself, for his family, for his community, and can think rather than 5 years out, think 50 years out. A father today can set his family on a course to a genuine and holistic rebuilding of human flourishing for each member of his family and for his family as a whole. Now, in order to do that, all right, the beginning of that work, this is not a comprehensive, exhaustive blueprint, but this is the beginning of a curriculum, if you will, a training progression that a man today who wants to seize that opportunity can go through to, in himself and for his family, rediscover, synthesize and apply, model, and coach others in his orbit to become more physically, mentally, adaptively, and emotionally healthy so that he is prepared and those around him are prepared to flourish. And so a lot of this has to do with taking what is now an overwhelming storm of information and competing narratives and commercialized self-help material, separating out the wheat from the chaff, identifying where the truth lies, the timeless, transferable, universal principles, and organizing them in a manner where from the ground up we can rebuild a model of fitness. Because, as we were saying, whole generations of us were brought up without any kind of holistic formation. We were caged animals on a narrow track, moving our way to one piece of cheese to the next through public education, institutions of higher learning, corporate rat race. And now we need to be able to think more broadly. We need to think more holistically and separate ourselves from some of those bad ideas that inspired or accelerated the choices that were made over the past 75 or 175 years that have led to this state of ruin. And so at Fit for Fatherhood, the training progression covers those 4 dimensions: physical, mental, adaptive, and emotional. And no matter what program you enroll in, you apply for, you will go through this entire progression from the ground up. It's just a question of the degree of depth and how thorough or how fast from program to program. That's the variation. But that is why the Fit for Fatherhood model is organized the way it is, to provide a holistic and logical progression from the ground up across these 4 dimensions. Okay. Now, that's talking about the substance of the implicit knowledge that our generation, the prior generation, the current generation of children has largely lost. So we need to rebuild that. But the other element is having the ability for community-centered learning and mentorship and support. So here on the screen, this will be very familiar to the veterans in the audience, but for those of you who didn't serve or have not been exposed to this, I know some people in the corporate and managerial space may also come across this. This is the OODA loop, OODA: observe, orient, decide, and act. Now, this originated back after World War II. There was an Air Force fighter pilot, who was trying to develop better doctrine, better modeling for aircraft to aircraft dogfights, and understanding how to better train pilots to win those dogfights. And he distilled down the dogfight mechanisms into these 4 steps. And then once that model had sort of been refined, it began being extended and extrapolated metaphorically to all sorts of decision making at all sorts of levels, not just the individual level, but all the way up to, thinking at a high strategic institutional level, through thinking through these 4 steps of how a decision is made and implemented. So at the observe phase is your data collecting. Right? The individual is taking in sights, sounds, motion. It's just a lot of data, a lot of sensory data coming in the observe phase. In the orient phase is you're making sense of the data. You're trying to figure out what the patterns are and how to identify, extrapolate, well, what's going to happen next based on what's happening, has happened up to this point. How do I put these clues together, connect these dots in such a way that I can now anticipate the next thing that will happen? And based on that, I make a decision about what I'm going to do. Now, when I execute my decision, you can think about this in a dogfight sense, you can think about this at like a corporate strategy sense. I decide, okay, here's my strategic choice, or here's my tactical maneuver that I'm going to make. As soon as I begin making that, as I'm acting, I put that into action, that feeds my observe phase again. Because now, 1, time has passed. 2, I've changed the system. And 3, in the time that I've been making that decision and putting it into practice, other actors in the environment are also making their decisions and actions. And so now I have new data to observe, right? So I have to once again bring in new data and orient on it again, synthesize it, pattern identification, extrapolate, so that I can make my next set of decisions. One of the big takeaways of this model is that those who succeed are the ones who can make faster and better iterations on the OODA loop. You have to move through the phase quickly. Speed is essential. Quality is also essential. So you have to find how to harmonize those things, because there's obviously some tension between speed and quality, particularly like you think about orientation, synthesizing information, making projections and forecasts. You can spend a lot of time doing that, or you can spend a little time. That trade-off is very situation dependent, but the core concept here is that you, the viewer, the father, the man out there in the world who has grown up in this environment, you are an independent operator. And there's a huge world of information out there that you're trying to observe and you're trying to orient on. But your attention, of course, is divided because, unlike me, you have not spent the last 4 years, in all likelihood, stepping back from your career to focus on this problem set exclusively, right? So the amount of time you're able to give to observing and orienting on your marriage and family life and the social dynamics that are impacting your wife and your children is constrained by your distraction as a rat in the industrial or corporate rat race. No insult meant, just like it's a limitation, right? If you're trying to keep that wheel spinning, if you're trying to chase that cheese, you have limited time to do this observing and orienting. So your decisions and actions are not well informed. That is the huge limitation. If you want to be ready to seize this opportunity to strengthen, to improve your family life, your children's childhood, then you need a way to speed up your OODA loop. You need a way to get more and better data coming in the observe phase, and you need a reliable way to synthesize that information and forecast, to project, to develop plans, consider alternatives. And it's simply beyond your limited bandwidth as an individual. Because once again, until 175 years ago, no human being had developed the biology or the neurology or the operating software, the cognition to operate independently, right? So we've painted ourselves into this corner where the very decisions that we've made that have put us in this terrible spot not only yield terrible consequences, but also undermine our ability to get ourselves out of this situation. And so it requires deliberate and aggressive action on your part to recognize and remedy these limitations so that you can speed up and improve the quality of your OODA loop. Now, prior to 175 years ago, you would have been able to rely upon your brothers, your father, your uncles, your grandfather, other men in your community as mentors, coaches, to hold you accountable, to keep you, to help you better orient and make better decisions for yourself, for your family, for your community. Given that you are not in that situation today, and given that there's not that network just waiting for you to come back to in all likelihood, the question now is, how do we, you and I, rebuild a network like that? What would it take for us to stop being isolated individuals and start being members of an authentic community of people who are invested in one another's long-term well-being and flourishing, who are operating from a similar playbook, going back to that Fit for Fatherhood curriculum, and helping one another build the life that we want for ourselves, for our wives and children, and for our future generations. All right, what would that take? Well, let's go to the next slide and find out. Okay. Here. So I already talked about why this is a veteran-led effort. And now I want to talk about why the motif for Fit for Fatherhood is, draws upon NASA and the moon landing, is because this is an urgent moment. Just as the space race during the Cold War was a moment of urgency where there was a necessity driving us to seize an opportunity to go from trailing behind to in the lead, to seize the initiative, so too are you and I, as fathers, as men today, in a moment where it is essential that we seize the initiative. And just as the NASA program, the astronauts who led that, as well as the operations planners, and the engineers, were predominantly veterans, but not exclusively, especially as the program went on. They began welcoming non-military personnel, non-veteran personnel in. So too must this effort be veteran-led, because veterans have that advantage over the typical civilian in their ability to formulate and implement a plan, not only individually, but as a team. We're going to cut this one a little short for time, and I'm going to pick up here in my next video. So this is going to be a little bit of a cliffhanger. What I want to go through, let's go back to our agenda. What I want to go through in the next portion, we've talked about the pendulum swing, how we got into this severe, dire situation, and why it's going to change back. We talked about, in order to be prepared, be ready to seize that moment, we need to remedy the fact that right now we have a very slow and unreliable OODA loop. As individual men, we need to find a way to band together and to pool our ability to collect and synthesize, select the useful data out of the noise and synthesize that in order to formulate plans and strategies and hold one another accountable, providing one another support and accountability and mentorship in implementing our individual strategies. Okay, so the next phase is to talk about where that needs to begin and how we can position ourselves to do that. In terms of streaming that information or producing a video to go through that last section, I will attempt to do that later today or maybe tomorrow. In the meantime, there's other videos that you can find on this channel that would be worth watching and cover related material, even though it's not exactly on point where this conversation is going. And you can find a lot of information, as I've been sharing along the way, at mr-homemaker.com, mrhomemaker.com. Because the first iteration of my attempt to share my experience with other men, rather than the Fit for Fatherhood framework, this community-based format, was a podcast and YouTube channel called Mr. Homemaker when I first stepped back from my career in order to focus on my domestic life. So I will be back. We will get into the where we go next and how we begin resolving the gaps that we are suffering from as individuals so that we can better position ourselves and our families and the next generation as the pendulum begins to swing. So until then, I appreciate your time. I look forward to you contacting me in the comments or on mr-homemaker.com. All right. Thank you.